Welcome. My name is Susan Strasser, and I'm the chair of the Takoma Park Arts and Humanities Commission. And the lecture tonight is part of a series of humanities lectures that we've inaugurated this year as part of a larger program called We Are Takoma. And one of the things that I want to do in this introduction is to call your attention to the leaflets that are on the back table that look like this, because they tell you about all the other We Are Takoma activities, lectures, films, poetry, exhibits, dance and music performances. We try to keep a lot of things happening, and sometimes the rain scares people away, but we've found that we have been doing a great job of getting a lot of interesting things coming to Takoma Park. Tonight we have Professor Evan Berry, who's an associate professor of philosophy and religion at American University. And he is going to give a lecture called Devoted to Nature, The Religious Roots of American Environmentalism, which is also the title of the book that he published last year with the University of California Press. And the other thing that I want to point to on the back table is a copy of the book for you to look at, and also order forms that you can use to order it at a special discount that says you know the author. So you might want to take a look at the stuff on the back table. And with that, I turn the podium over to Evan.
Thanks for coming out tonight. So I want to concentrate on the subtitle of the book, The Religious Roots of American Environmentalism. I want to talk specifically about how we might have different kinds of conversations about the relationship between religion and the environment in American culture. One of the ways you might hear that link get made is to talk about people's nature spirituality, their spiritual experiences in the natural world. Another way we might hear about this in the popular media is to think about the role of conservative religious groups in opposing climate change legislation. Another way we might think about it is to actually talk about religious traditions as either sources of environmental wrongdoing or of environmental solutions. But I want to focus on history, and I want to focus specifically on the history of the environmental movement as a way to explore these different ways of linking these two categories. So this is a picture of Lynn White Jr. He's a historian who published a really influential article in 1967 called The Historic Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. And you can see here from his quote that he was really skeptical about the role that Christianity had played in shaping Western and American ideas about nature. We shall continue to have a worsening ecologic crisis unless we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence except to serve man. He also had a sort of broader argument in which he claimed that religious worldviews shaped different cultures' opinions about the natural world. So he argued that North Atlantic societies, as primarily Christian societies, were shaped by in their thinking about nature by Christian experience, and that in other parts of the world we might see different ideas about nature shaped by different religious traditions. In the decades that followed the publication of this article, which was sort of one of the most widely cited articles in contemporary historical literature, the debate has often been about which traditions are either environmentally good or bad, and that debate still rages today. White made an important argument, and he's been widely cited, but there's a bunch of the story about the relationship between religion and the environment that he missed, and it's that I want to try to zero in on tonight. So rather than look to questions about the root causes of environmentalism or the root causes of environmental problems, I want to focus on specifically the history of the environmental movement. So I want to tell sort of two stories about where environmentalism comes from and what it is. We can call the first of these stories scientific environmentalism. We'll call the second one transcendental environmentalism. So this is my way of thinking about where the scientific environmentalism story comes from. It usually starts with Rachel Carson, who published a book called Silent Spring in 1962. And you can see from this newspaper article, it's often called the book that changed the world. So she wrote about the impact of DDT, the pesticide, on sort of birds and the ecosystem around birds, as a basis her book sort of launched a movement and ended up, DDT got banned, and sort of people started to realize that sort of science could inform citizen activism, and that activism could have real policy outcomes. So when we talk about environmentalism this way, usually the focus is on science, on policymaking, and on citizen organization. Often in the story, we also sort of feature sort of the hallmark achievements of 1960s and 1970s environmentalism. So also important from this era are the fact that most of America's primary legislative acts around the environment are from the 60s and 70s. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Wilderness Act, and also, importantly, the first Earth Day in 1970, April 22nd, and the 1972 Brundtland Report on sustainability, or noteworthy developments from this era. So again, the focus here is on environmentalism as a kind of social movement that has primarily focused on public policy and passing laws to regulate pollution. Sort of this idea about what environmentalism is focuses on these kinds of actors, maybe also Aldo Leopold, a famous ecologist from the 50s, who wrote and published in the same area. But we might tell a different story about where environmentalism comes from, one that's a little bit older. And here, this story, which I'll call transcendental environmentalism, usually starts with Henry David Thoreau. Many of you would be familiar with Thoreau. He wrote and published in the mid-19th century. His essays, especially Walden, a very widely read essay, sort of epitomized the genre that we now call nature writing. That was a new category at the time. And many people continue to read Thoreau's texts because of their sort of spiritual message, not just because of what they say about the environment. So there's sort of two ideas that thread their ways through most of Thoreau's writing and much of the other writing of the day. One, that nature is actually a space for spiritual reflection and moral cultivation. So this idea that sort of it's important to go out into nature and to use that as a way of meditating and improving oneself and understanding the human condition. So it's important to have nature for that reason. And the second idea is that in nature we find creatures and things and systems that are good of themselves, and that their goodness and their moral value exists independent of human beings. And so those two things get folded together. Today we call that sort of wilderness. Thoreau's word, he liked to talk about wildness, not wilderness. But this idea of wilderness as something we should protect, both because it's valuable for itself and also it's valuable because when human beings go there, they like it and they have experiences that are valuable to their personal growth and development. These are sort of classic transcendental ideas that really shape the way we still today talk about the environment. If we continue with the transcendentalist narrative of environmentalism, the next person we might cite would be John Muir, famous, of course, because he's the founder of the Sierra Club, which is still today a really important environmental organization, but also because of his writings. And there's actually a sort of a cult of personality around John Muir at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. He was personal friends with President Teddy Roosevelt. Sort of when he went to a town, it would be the event in that town. And so when he traveled around the West, speaking on his books and ideas, he drew really big crowds, sort of like this one gathered today. One of the things that's really interesting to me about Muir is that so much has been written on him, and few people can actually agree about whether he was a religious writer or whether he's a secular writer. So sort of this whole contradiction that I'm trying to raise about how we read the history of the environmental movement, we see it in Muir. So he's raised by a very, very traditional Scottish Presbyterian strict father who is dogmatic and forced the young John Muir to memorize extended passages of the Bible. And as a young man, Muir decides that that's not for him, and he goes his own way. Yet for his whole life, the way he writes about and talks about nature is consistently using the terms of Christian theology. So sin and redemption and resurrection and gospel, those are all terms that he comes back to again and again and again. So either you could read that as he flew away from his Christian upbringing towards something different, or you could argue that Christianity really, really heavily shaped the way he thinks about the natural world. And I would argue that that sort of ambiguity is a permanent feature of the way that Americans think and talk about nature. So rather than focus just on Muir as an individual case, which many people have done, I'd like to turn our attention to the group he founded and to think about some of its other contemporaries in sort of late 19th and early 20th century American culture. So this is some images from the early years of the Sierra Club, founded in 1872. And I would argue that it wasn't founded just to protect the natural landscapes of California, but actually to help the growing middle class in the West enjoy those landscapes. And it protected them because that allowed groups of people to enjoy them. In other words, it wasn't founded as a sort of environmental group that we would recognize it today. It was founded as a recreation club and found protecting the environment useful for pursuing recreation. So the club's many victories are well known. It was instrumental in securing the national parks at Yosemite, at Kings Canyon, at Sequoia, and its losses are also well known. They remain sort of scars in the memory of the environmental movement. So the damming of the Tuolumne River and the flooding of the Hetch Hetchy remains sort of a tragic loss for many people who were environmental activists, especially in California. But beyond these sort of political highs and lows, there's a whole bunch of stuff that the club did that usually flies below the radar. And if you go and dig through the club's archives and look at the historical record, this stuff really raises some interesting ideas. So the club's history is in some ways a sort of cult of personality around John Muir. It was really founded by him and at his behest, and many of the inner circle of leaders in the early generation were there because they thought that Mr. Muir had a historically revolutionary idea and that they should all sort of rally around him. So there was a sort of religious dynamic to the way he was appreciated by his peers. They also, the main thing they did was they had a big annual outing. This would bring hundreds of people from not just California, but from all over the country would travel to the Bay Area and gather there, and then travel as a sort of big caravan into the hills, either in the Sierra Nevada or elsewhere in the West, and have these expeditions, sort of almost like revival-style tent cities. So they would travel together in big groups. They would stay up late telling like campfire stories and singing hymns and songs. And experiencing nature in a way that we would have a difficult time recognizing as camping, because these groups were often 300 and 400 and 500 people strong. So I'll sort of move on with the suggestion that when we talk about the Sierra Club today, what we're talking about is an environmental organization. But if we talked about the Sierra Club in sort of pre-World War II era, what we would have been talking about was like a recreation club, something that was a sort of fraternal organization for mountain climbers and outdoor enthusiasts. So the Sierra Club also wasn't the only thing like that. In fact, even though it was founded in 1872, in sort of decades immediately after that, there were tons of other similar organizations that were a lot like it. So in Seattle, we have the Mountaineers. In Portland, Oregon, we have the Mazamas. We have the Appalachian Trail Club. We have the Adirondack Trail Club. A whole bunch of organizations similarly purposed to help groups of people from communities connect with the environment, to enjoy that, and then also to work to protect those environments as a way of securing the right to enjoy the environment. But these groups weren't sort of the only kind of organization that did that. At the same time, sort of during the Progressive era, you have a whole historical era where people get really enthusiastic about nature. The Boone and Crockett Club, founded by former President Roosevelt, the Audubon societies formed at this time, the Boy Scouts of America and the Girl Scouts of America and the Campfire Association. These organizations are all designed to help connect people with the environment. We could say there's a lot of great work from other scholars on this about sort of the end of agricultural America and the dawn of urban America and this desire to stay connected to the out of doors. But what I think really matters about this is that all of these groups are interested in sort of thinking about nature as a moral good, as something that's important for young men and women to go out and enjoy, something that it's really important to go out and have contemplative time away from the busyness of city life, and that those kinds of experiences are essential if we want to keep the frontier spirit of America alive and sort of maintain the moral exception that was America. This is all sort of premised on valuing nature. But the specifically Christian character of that project didn't really go away. So this is sort of unfair. I'm putting a picture and a newspaper article that aren't exactly paired. So throughout the teens and 20s and 30s, the Sierra Club and all the other organizations that I named regularly held major outdoor worship services, especially around Easter and Thanksgiving. And these would be outdoor-oriented Christian worship services. The Easter one would usually be a sunrise service. The Thanksgiving one would be sort of an agricultural theme Christian service. So the liturgy would mostly come from the Psalms, and a local Congregationalist pastor would usually come out and give the sermon and develop a liturgy around sort of environmental themes from the Bible. This is starting to sound more like present day than we might think. So the image I have here, which is, we'll get to see an actual picture of a Sierra Club worship service. This is from the Hollywood Bowl in Easter 1922, and it says, you can see on the picture, 50,000 people gathered. So this sort of idea of holding large outdoor Christian worship services was a thing in the early 20th century, and it sort of shows that there's this blurry edge between what was really mainstream Christianity and what we now think of as, isn't it funny that the Sierra Club would host services like this? But at the time, this is the sort of the spirit of the era. So here is a picture of the Thanksgiving worship service on Mount Davidson, which is in the Oakland Hills. This is something done almost every year, with some exceptions during the World War I era, organized by the Sierra Club and organized by Dr. Bade, who was one of Muir's close friends, the president of the Pacific Theological Institute, and the man who later ended up writing Muir's papers up into a biography. But this period in American history, even though these were Christian worship services, this was an experimental era for the way Americans thought about and talked about nature. So following the lead of people like Emerson and Thoreau, a lot of these services actually include materials from the Upanishads and from so-called Eastern traditions, sort of borrowing on those themes to underscore that this appreciation for nature isn't just to be found in the Bible, but in other sacred texts as well. But I would go a step further than that and to suggest that there's a sort of interesting developing shift in the way that these services exist. So Muir gave a series of lectures and actually wrote a book with the title, with the phrase Glacier Gospel in the model and in the title. And so he was really interested in glaciers as these symbols that we could relate to that helped do the kind of work that I've been trying to identify as that nature does for people. That going out and experiencing it can be transformative for people. So Muir specifically believed that glaciers were a really important place where that happens. If you hike way up into the mountains and you look at a glacier and you think about how slow it's moving and what tremendous force it has and what it does for everything downstream from it, that was sort of a key symbol for him of what happens in nature that we need to appreciate. So he coins this term Glacier Gospel. And we might now not call it that, but we could use a phrase like nature spirituality to mean something really similar. And I would go so far as to argue that the kind of spiritual orientation towards the Glacier Gospel that we find in the teens and 20s and 30s is really directly connected to the kind of spirituality that we find today that makes people buy hiking boots and glossy magazines with pictures of backpacking. I mean, there's such a thing as backpacking magazine. I mean, it's capturing the same spirit. Okay, so we can see all these interesting examples of Christianity and borrowing from Eastern or Asian religious traditions and sort of emerging spiritualities present from the very beginning of the environmental movement. So it's no wonder that we see an image like this. This is an image called Saint Albert. This is Al Gore in sort of hagiographic imagery holding a copy of the text, An Inconvenient Truth. And what's interesting is that this is from a blog of a prominent climate skeptic, basically saying, isn't it ridiculous that people who deny climate change are called heretics? Isn't it interesting that these secular people have their own kind of orthodoxy? It's a secular religion. But what's funny about that is that the joke's not that funny. And in fact, a lot of people would say, yeah, sure, Al Gore is a really important moral leader. And other people working to fight climate change, Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein, these people who we might call like secular saints who are proselytizing the church of climate change, you know, a lot of people like those people. And so this idea about sort of who counts as religion and whether those people are heretics or what's orthodoxy, that stuff's all mixed up now in the way we think about and talk about the environment. So I want to try to spend a couple minutes here in conclusion helping us sort that out. I want to argue on one hand that it's not really helpful to label environmentalism as like a quasi-religion or being like a religion, or to have images like this that imagine climate change leaders as sort of false prophets. On the other hand, I don't think it's really helpful to talk about environmentalism as something that's secular and bounded against religion. I'd like to draw a picture about the messiness of the religion-environment interface by focusing on the historical data that we've been looking at here. So these images are from an event, or actually a pair of events connected to the UN Climate Summit in New York in 2014. So this is sort of a major gathering of UN leaders in the lead up to the Paris agreements this last year. And the larger image, this sculpture, is from an event organized by St. Albert's daughter, that is Corinna Gore, who has a position at Union Theological Seminary. And the church, this church in sort of the upper west side, was completely decked out with these huge sculptures made of recycled materials. This is all sort of handmade, salvaged garbage. And they're hung, these were suspended above the audience. There were 4,000 or 5,000 people in attendance for a series of talks by really high-level religious leaders. Vandana Shiva, Al Gore, prominent Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, indigenous leaders spoke at this event. And so that doesn't really surprise us in many ways. Religious leaders have something to say about climate change as an issue that affects all people. The event was also followed by the press release in which the Rockefeller Foundation announced that they were divesting from fossil fuels. And so this is a chance for religious leaders to flex their muscles and say, look what we can do as moral leaders. We can even, compel investment bankers to change their practices. So this is a good example of what religion can do when it gets involved with the environmental issue. So clearly there's some relationship here between the power of religious leaders and of faith to move the way people think and talk about the environment. So I want to start to return us to where we began. I want to bring us back to Len White, who I spoke about a little bit at the beginning, and point out another claim that he makes in his argument. He argued that because the environmental crisis, as he saw it, was a religious problem, that the answer is necessarily related to religion. And in doing so, that we should try to find solutions to the environmental crisis in religion. And he suggested, sort of casually, that we might look to someone like St. Francis as a patron saint of the environment. Now, this is really interesting, I think, because the current Pope is the first to take this name. We finally have a Pope Francis, the patron saint of ecology, according to Lynn White. And he has taken great initiative to show leadership on the environmental issue. So his papal encyclical from this last year, Laudato Si, sort of explains what the Catholic teaching has to say about the environment. And a lot of people believe that sort of the timing and weight of that document was really important in helping galvanize international agreement and ambition in the lead up to the Paris Agreement this last year. What's interesting too is that some of the groups of people who were most enthusiastic about this encyclical were actually outside the Catholic Church. Many Catholics were excited about it, of course, but secular environmental groups couldn't wait for this thing to come out. They were super excited about it. And so I think it says something really important that we now are at a moment when the so-called secular environmental groups are they're falling over themselves to partner with religious institutions to create solutions and ideas about how to respond to climate change. So the fact that Catholic social teaching on an environmental issue is sort of uncontroversially accepted by green groups brings us back to a historical moment. So I want to conclude by saying that it makes more sense to think about the relationship between religion and the environment as something that's been there from the very beginning. It's not contrived, it's not anything new, it's not inauthentic. This movement of faith and the environment or faith and religion into the environmental movement isn't an influx, it's a return sort of in keeping with the historical spirit of the environmental movement. I would argue that when we see things like Laudato Si, when we see the enthusiasm of environmental organizations for religious teaching, what it's doing is actually getting us back to the foundations of the American environmental movement. So thank you very much for coming out tonight, and I'd love to see if anybody has questions. Please.
My name is Kolya. Okay. Sure. My name is Kolya Greiner, and I've worked professionally really all of my adult life in the intersection of faith and environment. For many years working with United Methodist Women, we established green teams in churches across the country. And then I worked for the Catholic Climate Covenant for 7 years. Before Pope Francis came on the scene. And although I happen not to be Catholic, I have a great appreciation for Catholic social teaching. And now I work on a more regional basis for Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, working on watershed issues, and water, as many of us know, is going to be a crucial issue in the coming decades as climate change impacts that more. I'm delighted to see how you made the connections here and affirm that, in fact, while Lynn White's article was in some ways blaming religion as part of the problem, that there are roots within the Christian tradition, and you weren't doing an interfaith analysis of what other religions offer too, but particularly the double-edged sword of how Christianity, on the one hand, in one camp, has objectified the natural world and made it and set up this kind of dualistic thinking of separating ourselves from the natural world, and yet then you have the Franciscan tradition, which unfortunately has largely been sort of watered down and made into a bird bath symbol, which is deeply rich. And I wonder if you can share a bit more about his understanding, which actually sounds very indigenous, when in treating the natural world as in a familial way, like brother sun, sister moon, brother bird, sister water, these kinds of relationships. And and perhaps how that kind of perspective can really infuse a spiritual understanding into the current environmental movement.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of great observations there. I wish I had something more fully realized to say about the Franciscan tradition in particular. I know that there's really interesting work being done on it now. I think, in fact, as people started to understand where Pope Francis was headed with this project, even within the church, they returned their gaze to Francis's writings with a fresh attention that he hadn't had in a couple hundred years. So even within the Franciscan tradition, the sort of environmental possibilities have not been fully realized, and I think we're starting to see a little bit more of that now. Also, St. Ignatius is a little bit less environmentally friendly with his martial qualities, but within the Jesuit order, there is great energy on these matters right now. And the Jesuit institutions all around the world are thinking about how to make Laudato a key teaching document, both in their lower schools and in their university system around the world. So Laudato sort of had phase one of its implementation, which was to get international press attention and turn up the loudspeakers for politicians in the lead up to Paris. And now it has phase two, which was planned very carefully by the Vatican, and from the very get-go, that after the optimistic, they sort of believed we can get an agreement in Paris, and after that, we will have this document that's going to continue to shape the way that Catholic institutions and parishes think about and talk about the environment for a long time. That isn't going to play out smoothly everywhere. There's some parts of the church that are more resistant to that than others. I think in Australia and Mexico, we have some, shall we say, archbishops of the old guard who are less willing to embrace these new reformulations of Francis. But then in many parts of the world, especially the Philippines and Latin America, you see quick progress on this stuff. So appreciate that. Yeah.
Hello. Why did you title the book The Religious Roots of American Environmentalism and not The Christian Roots?
That's a good question. So part of what I want to do here is to tell a story about how Christianity set some of the key terms on which the American environmental movement is rooted, but there are other interesting ways, especially at the early parts of the 20th century, where these other theological streams start to enter in. I didn't want that stuff to be completely screened out. So what's really interesting is that I want to insist that environmentalism has always been religious, and that for the most part in America, that's been Christianity, but it's also a religious mixture, like American religion more generally. So speaking not about environmentalism for a second, there are lots of American evangelicals who believe in reincarnation, for example. And so if we live in a society where evangelical Christians can believe in reincarnation, we also live in a society where primarily Christian environmental types could also cite the Bhagavad Gita as a key text without ever thinking that was like out of place. Please.
So I guess how have other religions impacted environmentalism in America and also in other parts of the world?
That's a wonderful question. Let me say a little something about the United States and then a little something about the rest of the world. So remember, I tell these two stories about how we think about environmentalism. If we focus on the transcendental story, one of the chapters that I sort of stopped with the Sierra Club and the Progressive era, I would argue that there's sort of a line that continues into the 1950s and 1960s and gets involved with like the beatniks and the hippies and the counterculture of the mid-century. And that at that moment, there's a lot of attention to Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism, and also Taoism as things to be looked to for inspiration about the environment. So if you've ever come across beatnik poetry, especially like Gary Snyder, this Zen and Tao stuff is really important to the way he thinks about and talks about the environment. And he was super popular for a very long time. And it's not just Snyder, but sort of the whole spirit of the counterculture, especially on the West Coast, the way they thought about nature, heavily borrowed from Buddhism. And there's some value there. In the rest of the world, these stories don't get told as much, but there are whole other environmental movements in other parts of the world that don't really look like the kind of environmental movement we have. So one of the most famous of these is the Chipko movement in India. This is founded in the 1980s by a guy named Sundarban Bagwal. And this is where the term tree huggers come from. So he's actually organizing villagers to resist logging by hugging trees, but they're doing so according to it's a religious practice that they're engaging in. They're making kinship with trees. There's another similar movement in Thailand, and this is active today, where there are monasteries where the monks go to a forest that's about to be cut down, and they ordain all the trees in the forest by they go through a full ordination ritual and make the trees into monks. And because it's a law in Thailand that you can't defame a monk, the loggers would get in trouble with the government if they hurt the trees. So using sort of other kinds of religious ideas to engage in environmental practice is still a big thing. And it looks really different in different parts of the world. The examples go on and on and on, but there's lots of really cool stuff going out there that just doesn't look like the way we here in the United States do environmentalism. It's a great question. Cool. Well, I really appreciate everybody coming out.
We really appreciate hearing from you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, please.
So I was I was a seminary student at Union Theological Seminary some 20 years ago, and Dr. Larry Rasmussen was at that time teaching there, and he's one of his more recent books. He uses the overarching theme of singing a song in a strange land, so it's drawing from the Psalm tradition, and he posits that we're going to be entering a strange land in these coming decades and in this century with the impact of climate change and environmental destruction, and yet the faith traditions can, if they mine their own traditions for the spiritual resources for resilience, can weather this storm, literally. And therein he tells a story about, and I'm lapsing on my memory right now, but it's somewhere in Africa where currently the church actually ordains people to be ecological stewards, and it's part of the membership of the church. And people receive titles for actually taking on this ministry, and I just that's a vision I would like to see more churches take on.
Yeah, it's a really these are interesting times we live in, and some of the questions that we might ask of history here, we could ask of ourselves too. So at what point, when we talk about mining traditions, I'm always curious about that term, right? I mean, not because I think it's appropriate that traditions are always reevaluating and reinventing themselves. They're not stable things. Christians have been a lot of different things over the millennia, as have Buddhists and Hindus and everybody. They're cultures in motion. So there's nothing wrong with sort of intentionally changing your tack. But I also wonder if there are ways in which there are pressures on religions to sort of act in line with ideas that come from outside of them. And so in some ways, we actually sort of know what we need to do. Part of that we can task religion with doing some of that work. Some of that work ought happen outside religion. So the sort of more explicit we can be about that, and the more explicit we can more honest we can be about where we get our ideas from and how we orient our goals, I think the better we can work together to sort of achieve these big picture. These are global questions, right? So figuring out how this stuff happens across and within societies is tricky business, but it's a great question, and I've just been really, I don't know, I'm really impressed by the questions. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.